Good evening and a very warm welcome to St John's College and to this year's Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture. I'm Sue Black and I have the honour of being the 37th President of St John's College. We are very proud to be associated with this lecture, as Sidney Ball was a prominent figure at St John's in modern history as a socialist thinker and as an educational reformer. Born in Perthshire in Worcestershire in 1857, he graduated from Oriel College reading classics, but we did not hold that against him. He joined St John's as a fellow in philosophy in 1882, and 3 years later he became our senior tutor. And I'm delighted that we have our current senior tutor in the room as well. I'm reliably informed that Sidney Ball also applied to be president in 1909, but he was deemed to be too progressive for the time. So I don't know what that says about presidents at St John's. In 1883, he was one of the founders of the Toynbee Hall, and in 1895, he became a founding member of the Oxford University Fabian Society, which was an offshoot of the Fabian Society, which is Britain's oldest political think tank. In 1916, he became an architect of the D.Phil degree, and his thinking was influential in the introduction of the PPE degree. He had so much to answer for, did he not? And he campaigned for the admission of women to full membership of the university and the abolition of compulsory chapel. He really was quite a progressive individual. When Ball died in 1918, the Barnett House Committee renamed their annual lecture in his honour, as he was their first chairman. And the event brings distinguished speakers to Oxford each autumn to discuss key themes in social policy and intervention. Ball strongly believed that places of learning should be open to all, and I do hope that he'd approve of the modern St John's, with its focus firmly set on quality, equality, diversity, and wider access opportunities. So, a very warm welcome to St John's. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Jane Gingrich, who's going to introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you, Jane. Can I hand over to you?
Thank you so much. I would like to wish you all a warm welcome to this year's Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture, which we've been holding since 1917. We are again in the beautiful St. John's College and are deeply thankful for this opportunity. And thank you to the college for hosting this event, in particular to Professor Dame Sue Black for her generosity and in hosting this wonderful event. So I'm Jane Gingrich. I'm a professor of social policy in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, or DSPI, as we familiarly know it. And it's a great pleasure for our department to be hosting this year's lecture. The first lecture, as I mentioned before, was given over 100 years ago in 1917. And this was very shortly after Barnett House, which is the department's current home, was founded in 1914. When Sidney Ball, the chairman of the Barnett House Committee, died in March of 1918, the annual talks were renamed as a Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture. Our Sidney Ball Lecture series has included luminaries such as John Maynard Keynes, Mrs. Sidney Webb, R.H. Tawney, Sir William Beveridge, and R.H. Titmuss, to name but a few of the earlier speakers. We are also especially delighted to have Sidney Ball's great-grandson, Leo Dobbs, in the audience, and his great-great-grandson, William Dobbs. So before I introduce today's speaker, I wanted to say something about the Department of Social Policy and Intervention. DSPI has its origins in Barnett House, which was founded in Oxford in 1914, and 30 years later became part of the university. Barnett House was pioneering in its goal to be a center for the study of contemporary social and economic problems and for the preparation of young men and women for social research. We very much like to think that DSPI continues this tradition, and you can see that we continue to excel in what our students do in terms of what we recruit and the careers they go on to have. Our research continues to be cross-cutting and make a significant difference to the lives of people across the globe. Just now, a number of our colleagues are in Bogota, Colombia, at the Global Ministerial Conference to End Violence Against Children, working with leaders across the world to engage in work that makes lives safer, the lives of children safer and healthier. And this very much brings us to today's speaker, who we are absolutely delighted agreed to give this year's Sidney Ball lecture. who has really made a profound set of contributions to the study of violence. So we're delighted to have Manuel Eisner, who is the Wolfson Professor of Criminology at the University of Cambridge and Deputy Director of the Cambridge Institute for Criminology, joining us to give this lecture. Professor Eisner is a criminologist specializing in the study of interpersonal violence across societies and historical time periods. His work has combined deep engagement with historical data on crime with a study of its psychological foundations. He has looked to explain over an 800-year course of history why homicide rates vary, showing substantial declines in rates over time. His recent work has a local connection. Professor Eisner has mapped homicide rates in Oxford in the 13th and 14th century, mapping their location and asking why Oxford was a hub for violent crime, with many more murders than other similar places. In so doing, he has reflected on the social structures that permit more violent crime to emerge and opened up fundamental research questions as to how societies establish and maintain order and cooperation. In the realm of developmental criminology, Professor Eisner investigates the psychological and social mechanisms that contribute to violent behavior throughout an individual's life, including engaging in an incredible project that has been following the lives of young people in Zurich since 2004. In so doing, he's focused in particular on childhood and youth and interventions that can make the lives of children better in ways that reduce long-run violence, something that is near and dear to the researchers in this department. His work has developed into a critical research stream on violence prevention over the life course. He has many awards and accolades, but to name just a few. The 2011 Selin Glueck Award from the American Society of Criminology, the 2017 ESC European Criminology Award for Lifetime Contribution to European Criminology, and the 2021 Jerry Lee Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Society of Criminology's Division for Experimental Criminology. So Professor Eisner, thank you very much for joining us today. It is an absolute pleasure to have you and a real honor. And we look forward to your talk on No More Violence by 2030, Where Next for the UN Global Violence. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear Jane. I will be talking to you tonight about global violence reduction goals, and I will structure my talk in 6 parts. I will start with a brief introduction. I will then talk about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the related violence reduction goals. I will then outline for you the global strategy to end violence against children and articulate some concerns about the way this strategy is defined and what it tries to achieve. And then I will be talking about global violence trends and whether the Sustainable Development Goals are starting to make an impact on global violence trends, and move on to ask, how do societies become less violent, and then end with some conclusions. So this is the program for today. And while I'm talking to you, this is my introduction now, I'm also talking to myself. And the reason why I'm saying I'm talking to myself is that as I was preparing for this talk, I realized that actually almost exactly 10 years ago in Cambridge at King's College, we organized a global conference to address the topic of reducing violence in the world. This was a conference organized between the Institute of Criminology and the World Health Organization. And we asked the question at the time, what does it take to reduce levels of violence across the globe by 50% in 30 years? It was a very exciting conference. I loved the conference. We just brought together 150 colleagues. We had no policy, well, we had policy engaged people, but it was not a policy facing conference. So we wanted to have this protected space where we were not trying to convince policymakers of A, B, and C, but just say, here are the academics, here is a practical question for you, what are the answers that you can come up with? And then we try to synthesize the answers in the report. I've outlined here the main conclusions, and I just wanted to briefly summarize them because I might actually come back to these conclusions at the end of my talk. We set six big topics. We said, first of all, tackle the biggest problem areas first. So we said, focus on where the biggest problems are in terms of cities, in terms of countries. Where are the biggest problems? Go there and try to work there. Stop reinventing the wheel. So we said, there is many interesting solutions around. Do not reinvent existing solutions all the time. Work with the kind of solutions that we already have and disseminate and replicate best practices globally. Harness the power of big data in violence reduction. So develop data scope, access, and develop standards so that things can be compared across different sites. Protect the most vulnerable. Focus on children, youth, and women. Fifth, institutional context matters. So that's the issue of improving leadership governance and policies of violence prevention. And finally, the whole is bigger than the sum of parts. Create global strategic alliances to prevent violence. Oh, by the way, this is me, if you can see me, yes, a little bit younger. So this is what we did. Now, we thought at the time that setting the goal of reducing violence by 50% in 30 years was pretty ambitious. But within a year, our goals became kind of looking like pretty mundane and unambitious, because a year later, the United Nations published the Sustainable Development Goals under the title of Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In the resolution, it says, we resolve between now and 2030 to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. This was a hugely ambitious agenda. It built, of course, on the first 15 years of the Millennium Goals, but it became even bolder and bigger and broader. You can see this here symbolized. You had the Millennium Goals with just 7 substantive goals, and it expanded to overall 16 substantive goals. And if you look at it, in the Millennium Development Goals, they were talking about reducing poverty. In the Sustainable Development Goals, it says no poverty. So they had, the idea was you had to be even more ambitious, because you kind of like, you have the sequence of goals, and if you don't want to stagnate in your goals, and so you have to formulate them even in an even more ambitious way. The goals are structured in such a way. Oh, by the way, I'm just curious here about the thing. I asked my students last week whether they had ever heard about the Sustainable Development Goals before I told them about them. And I was a little bit shocked about the result. Now can I ask this audience, just briefly, how many of you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals? Could you please put up your hand? Wow, this is very impressive. Okay, this is much better than our criminology students. So, just to say, the way this is structured is that you have 16 overarching goals. So, for instance, ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Then you have 169 targets. So these are operational objectives at a relatively high level. So for instance, by 2030, make sure that there is universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. And then you have a set of indicators which are agreed with the United Nations. And they're the kind of measures that make sure that you can actually track whether you're making progress towards achieving these goals. I would just want to say something about the role of targets in policy making. Targets have a number of benefits, if you will. They create clear policy direction. they create some level of accountability, they boost motivation and engagement, they advance efficient allocation of resources, they may be the basis for monitoring and evaluation, bolster benchmarking and comparability, and encourage long-term planning. But they also have some risks, and I think it's important to understand these risks. They can lead to disillusionment if these goals are not achieved. They can lead to oversimplification of really complex processes and complex issues, because somebody says, well, we just had this. Well, you had lots of inflation, or I've reduced inflation a lot, and really the policy measures have little to do with these things. So exposure to forces outside policy control is sometimes just ignored, or can lead to non-achievement of these targets. And there is some often problematic attribution of positive trends to policies. So something positive happens, and then policymakers say, okay, this is because we have been doing A, B, and C, which actually isn't true. So what do the Sustainable Development Goals say with respect to addressing violence? Addressing violence, and that's quite an achievement in itself, addressing violence is in several of the Sustainable Development Goals. For the first time in human history, violence reduction becomes something that's an explicit global policy goal. That's quite revolutionary, although one has to say that, of course, the idea that peace is something that can be achieved through policy means is much older. If you think about Enlightenment thinking, David Hume, for instance, is talking about the necessity of peace as a foundation of civil society and the ability to create fairer and more inclusive societies. There is one goal, though, Goal 16, that puts the issue of peace and reduction of violence at the center, and that's Goal 16. It says, we're determined to foster peaceful, just and inclusive societies which are free from fear and violence. There can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. That was quite an interesting strategic move at the time to say the reduction of violence is not just one additional goal in addition to all the others. It's a key element of sustainability. Without reducing violence, you don't achieve sustainability. Without sustainability, you can't achieve a reduction in violence. Now, I want to focus today on 3 targets. And these are Target 5.2, Target 16.1, and Target 16.2. Goal 5 is gender equality, and under gender equality, Target 5.2 is by 2030, so we're now 6 years away from that year, eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private spheres. Target 16.1 is substantially reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. And substantially reduce, just to translate this into a target, it's commonly understood to mean reduced by 50%. And then there is Target 16.2, end abuse, exploitation and trafficking and all forms of violence and torture against children. So that's how they're formulated. By the way, Keir Starmer is much more cautious at the moment. He also has some targets at the moment related to violence, but he talks about reducing levels of violence, for instance, against women and girls by 50% in 10 years, I think. In a few minutes, I will ask you to answer a question. So you can already take out your mobile phones because you can answer this question on your mobile phones. But before I will ask you this question, well, you think that at least one of these 3 targets will be achieved, will be met by 2030. That will be the question in a few minutes. But I just want to add two slides here to give you an idea of what that target means in practice. First of all, I want to show you the size of the problem. So if you want to reduce violence by this amount, then You need to reduce the number of homicides per year from around 430,000 at the moment to around 200,000, more or less, in the next 6 years. Homicides, by the way, account for the vast majority of all violent deaths on Earth, still today, despite all the organized conflict that is currently going on. Epidemiological data also suggests that about a third, 1 out of 3 women aged 15 and over have experienced physical or sexual intimate partner violence. And that comes out of a large systematic review conducted by De Vries and a group of colleagues. And about 1 out of 2 children under age 18 have experienced violence in the past year. And that's a big study by Susan Hillis, James Mercy and colleagues. That was conducted, by the way, not by coincidence in 2016, because it was related to the Sustainable Development Goals, just to have a benchmark at the beginning of that period to say, this is where we're starting and this is where we need to go. I also wanted to just show you the variety of different problems that addressing violence implies. It's not a homogeneous phenomenon, but you have a number of different things that you want to address. And so it's not easily reduced to either just domestic violence or just bullying. There is so many different manifestations of interpersonal violence that need to be addressed with these policies. So this takes me back to the question. And now I hope this is going to work. We will see. Type in your answer. We will see how this is moving as the answers come in. This is interesting. And I think it's interesting for a number of reasons. One reason is that there are all kinds of different possible reasons. I don't know whether anybody other than myself said yes, but it doesn't matter even if it's 1 or 2. I mean, it's an overwhelming sense in this audience that they will not be met. And I think I would agree with that. But there is an interesting question here. If you think about the 2 targets that are formulated as absolute targets, there is no more violence against women and girls. There is no more violence against children. Whether that's actually in terms of policy making, is it a wise target? And maybe it is. And it would be an interesting question to think about. And is it a realistic target? It was formulated this way after some discussions among the interest groups, because it was felt that it was a human rights goal rather than an empirical goal. So you have a tension between what you say if you come from a human rights perspective and you say violence against children is a human rights violation and therefore it should never happen, or whether you come from an empirical social science perspective and you say in any place other than paradise, you're never going to get there. And so it is not a realistic policy goal, and therefore you'd better not try to articulate these goals. And by the way, I just wanted to add here, because I was just saying that from the Millennium Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, there was some escalation of making the goals even more ambitious. Where do you go from an ambitious goal that's already down to 0? You can't improve further. So I would just want to raise this as something that concerns me a little bit as an interesting problem. But it has to be said here that, now I have to find a way to get back. And that's not entirely trivial, but I think I can manage. Yes. There is, especially over the last few years, there's been increasing concern about the extent to which the Sustainable Development Goals will fail. The Millennium Goals ended on a very optimistic note. And so, but with the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a completely different matter. And I've shown you just a few quotes. Some of them relate to specifically to SDG 16. But I also just show you the latest report on the latest Sustainable Development Goals report 2024, which has just come out quite recently, which says progress has ground to a halt or been reversed across multiple fronts despite reaffirmed pledges. But at the same time, you mentioned the conference in Bogota. I was looking at the conference in Bogota. There is also a lot of optimism. There is kind of like this polarized way, because I think partly because there is this desire to maintain kind of like the idea that we can get there if there is just enough political will. And so when you look at the website, the agenda of the conference in Bogota is under the motto that together we can demonstrate that an SDG target of ending violence against children is not only aspirational, but attainable. The solutions exist, now it is time to take them to scale. And the question is this true? And much of what I will be saying in the remainder of this talk is around the question, is this true? If this was just in one document, just in this conference document, I would say maybe this is just advertising for this one conference. But it's a view that is reiterated in different places. We know what we need to do, and it just takes additional political effort to get there. And you will see in my conclusions that I'm not entirely convinced that this is actually the case. If you think about this claim that we just saw, it makes a number of interesting assumptions, and I think it's important to just briefly reflect on these assumptions. First of all, it assumes that we correctly understand what the causes of violence are. Now, we understand a lot about the causes of violence, but I'm not always sure that we understand enough to be sufficiently precise in knowing what exactly we need to do to address violence. It also assumes, for instance, that all causes of violence are malleable. They can be changed with enough goodwill. So it assumes, for instance, that there is no biological or other factors that play a role in just making humans in some circumstances to behave violence, or that all the circumstances can be eliminated and they never happen. It makes also assumptions that the solutions are known. And people would probably, experts of prevention science, would probably disagree about the extent to which these solutions are known. It also makes assumptions that the effect sizes that come from trials of prevention trials are large. You know, you want to reduce not just by 20 or 30%, you want to run prevention programs that bring violence against children down to zero. That's very, very large effect sizes. It's impossibly large effect sizes, but let's say it's very large effect sizes. And then the assumption is that you can take these effect sizes from trials and take them to scale, and they still remain very big effects. And so the question is this actually true or is it not? Oh, this is twice the same slide. So from here, I want to move on to saying, well, what is the strategy to end violence against children? So I will be focusing in the next few slides just specifically on violence against children. I just want to check my time. Yep, that looks fine. What are the key foundations of this strategy? I focus on violence against children partly because I know that tradition better than other traditions, but probably also because, as I understand it, as I see the field, this is the field where probably most of the activity has taken place over the last 10 years or so. What has happened is that a collaborative network of stakeholders has developed. It is based on a shared scientific model rooted in public health approaches. There is a comprehensive global programming package, which is called INSPIRE. There is a data in action approach, so translating data into policy action. And I will just focus on one example, the violence against children surveys. And There is innovation in global prevention resources, and in one of them, Oxford plays a really leading role, namely the Parenting for Lifelong Health packages. I just want to briefly outline these 5 pillars so that you get an idea of what this all entails. When you look at the collaborative network that has emerged over these years, remember that we said 2014, we need to bring together these coalitions globally. These coalitions partly already existed, but they have certainly become more active, more tightly interacting with each other. And the conference in Bogota is one of the expressions of this more tighter interactions. You have UN agencies led by the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and UNODC probably as the main actors in this field. UN Women is more active in the field of violence against women. United Nations Human Rights and the World Bank Group. Then you have a number of national aid agencies. This is just a part of the list, but UK Aid, US Aid, CDC played an important role as national agencies, national health agencies, and national development agencies that supported all the activities to a large extent. And then there is a number of countries, including Canada, Australia, Sweden, that support the Goal 16 agenda and provide resources, organizational and financial resources. There are philanthropic donors, the Oak Foundation, Wellcome Trust, Save the Children, Together for Girls, and the network of universities, and again, UK universities play a major role in this network. University of Edinburgh, University of Oxford, I forgot, Bangor University, of course, SOAS plays an important role. So there's a number of universities in the UK that play an important role in this network. Increasingly also universities in the global south. It is based on a shared scientific model, a public health approach which is focused around, which was developed in the 1990s by Etienne Krug and James Mercy in the Global Report on Violence, which was published in 1998, and which now has, I think, 16,000 citations. It's one of the major benchmark publications in the field of violence prevention. Around the topic, what are the risk and protective factors, what are the consequences, and what can be done? One important shared scientific basis is what is called the social ecological model for understanding and preventing violence against children. This model comes from work by Uri Bronfenbrenner, and basically what it does, it says you have to think about the causes or the risk factors for violence along this onion-like model, and you list the risk factors down here in these areas. I will come back to this in a few minutes. Then there is a work package, a framework to mobilize political action, and that's the INSPIRE framework, 7 strategies for ending violence against children. And again, it repeats, by implementing the proven solutions set out in the INSPIRE package, we can nurture generations of children and adults who are free from violence. So again, this is kind of like, I'm just reiterating this as, this is what you can achieve if you do the INSPIRE framework. INSPIRE is an acronym which includes implementation and enforcement of laws, changing norms and values, create safe environments, support parent and caregivers support, income and economic strengthening, response and support services, and education and life skills. I'm not going to go into the details, but I just wanted to say that INSPIRE is really quite I'm genuinely impressed with what has been developed. Now, this is not just a political document or a brief kind of an outline of goals. If you go on the website, you can see that there are detailed technical packages. If you are a local policymaker in a city somewhere in the world, you can go and look at this INSPIRE technical package. You get detailed online instructions, you get webinars, you get forums that help you to organize your work and so on and so forth. So you have training materials, you have indicator guidance. If you want to do a little survey in your city, in your neighborhood, about what is the level of violence in your place. So you can use all these resources to organize your work. It's been downloaded several hundreds of thousands of times. Unfortunately, what the Inspire website also says, it's been mostly downloaded by users in high-income countries. So there is this problem of usage, despite all the efforts of usage in low-income societies. There is a data-to-action approach, as I mentioned, which is closely linked, by the way, to the Inspire framework, which is, there's other data-to-action approaches, but one of the key cornerstones is the Violence Against Children and Youth surveys, which were initiated in 2007 by CDC. So CDC is short for the Centers for Disease Control in the United States. And they developed in 2007 the first Violence Against Children survey in South Africa. They are nationally representative service. And again, the service that they provide is that you have a standardized instrument that can be compared across countries and can be compared over time. And it provides policymakers in different places with a baseline to assess levels of violence and then discuss what needs to be done. It has been implemented now in 24 mostly low-income countries, and it covers 30%, the representative service now cover 30% of youth, of the world's youth that live in low-income countries, which is quite an astonishing achievement if you think about it. And in almost all of these countries, this is the first time ever that epidemiological data exist that allow policymakers and stakeholders to actually address the problem more effectively. And finally, there is innovation in global prevention resources. The starting point, 2014-2015, was that when it comes to parenting interventions, there was this problem that some parent training programs exist. They've been developed, they started developing these parent training programs in the 1950s, 1960s. That was the first models that were developed. But most of them are disseminated privately. They cost quite a lot of money. They are low in cultural adaptation. They have low local support and they have limited scalability. And that's where initially a group of researchers from the University of Cape Town and from Oxford University and the University of Reading came together with WHO and UNICEF, and started developing a new free program that was called, or still is called, Parenting for Lifelong Health. So it's a movement to accelerate the scale-up of evidence-based, freely available, inclusive, and culturally sensitive parenting solutions that can be delivered within existing systems. It's been implemented in over 35 countries worldwide. The materials have reached about 210 million people. That's an enormous number. It's just outstanding. This is, there's nothing comparable to what they have achieved over the last 10 years. So far, quite a large number of randomized controlled trials or other evaluation studies with similar designs have been conducted. And I'm generally impressed because I've done my own of a different parenting program, a randomized controlled trial with much more sobering effects. This is really generally impressive at different scales, and the scope and breadth of the positive effects on child maltreatment, on parenting, intimate partner violence, and so on, is genuinely impressive. So I want to end this part with 3 words of caution. And the first one is about the ecological model. And I want to ask the question, well, should we actually retire the ecological model? It's been reiterated many hundreds of times in different versions. And the problem that I see with this model is that it gives people the confidence that it explains something, but it has nothing to do with explaining anything. It's just listing a bundle of risk factors and sorting. It's kind of like a sorting exercise. We have lots of correlations, and let's just put them into this onion model, and then we start believing that it actually explains something, but it doesn't. And so if one, for instance, wants to talk generally about the relationship between macro level, state level processes and what happens at the individual level, we need to move forward to actually having explanatory models that tell us how this trickle-down process happens and what it does to the life course of people, how this manifests itself in services that actually arrive in the life world of people on a daily basis. So this is my first concern, or just a first suggestion, maybe retire this ecological model, maybe it's done its job, and think about something better. The second question is, do we really understand what needs to be done? And I just wanted to flag up here that systematic reviews on prevention and intervention, if you're familiar with this literature, you will find that almost any type of intervention, whether it's a social skills type of intervention or whether it's a situational intervention, the systematic review always comes out with an average positive effect size. They're not usually very big, but they're always on the positive end. If you look more closely, you usually find that this average effect size is kind of like a combination of very heterogeneous effects. Many of them come from small-scale studies and often conducted by the program developer, so the generalizability is low. The effect sizes vary a lot between context, study, and implementation quality. Usually they're based on very short-term assessments. So you do, and this is not true, by the way, for parenting for lifelong health, but I know this for this area, many parenting interventions, you ask the parents 2 weeks or a week after the parent training program has been delivered, has your parenting improved? And because the parents will know what the goal of the parent training program was and they try to be nice to you, they say, yes, of course, I'm much better now. But they will have forgotten after a year, but usually very often these data just don't exist to look at more long-term effects. And so there is a number of problems. I just wanted to remind the audience of one big resource that's out there, Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development, which was originally called Blueprints for Youth for Violence Prevention, which have been developed in the 1990s, which systematically assesses programs that aim to improve mental or physical health. It's a US-based resource at the University of Colorado, and they've examined about 1,500 programs, and they go, Francis Gardner, by the way, is part of this group that examines these programs. They've examined 1,445 programs, and they say, we can't say anything about whether these programs do anything positive or negative. They have unknown, no, or detrimental effects. 97 are called promising, and 16, just 1% of the programs, are assessed as being effective. So this shows you something that actually, when you look more closely, the claim that we know what the solutions are seems to be, let me say cautiously, slightly overstated. So it seems that there is still a lot of noise in the system in terms of what we actually know. And I would like to end this discussion with just one final remark. Are we overconfident about us with our assumptions about what we know about human development? One of the things that you will often find in this literature is the high emphasis on early prevention. And just to say, I'm not at all against early prevention. I'm all in favor of early prevention. But there is some of these statements in the public domain. Here was the Allen report, by the way. This was, if some of you may remember, this was the report with the healthy brain and the very visual on the front page. Early intervention will have a positive effect on reducing crime and therefore must be at the heart of crime strategies. The evidence is actually not so very strong. So Joe Murray and I, together with also Francis Gardner, by the way, conducted a systematic review of developmental risk factors. And probably I just want to summarize this very briefly in a few sentences. I'm not going to go through the details. When you look at these studies, the evidence for the extent to which you can predict who will end up being high on violence or crime at age 18 or 20 is actually rather limited. There is no straight motorway that leads from early childhood risk factors to becoming highly criminal. There is lots of other things going on, and there is these oversimplifications which may end up making the progress more difficult. So what do we know about how much progress has been made? I will have to speed up a little bit here because I realize I'm starting to run out of time. Here is another resource from Oxford, namely Our World in Data. And one of the things that it's a fantastic resource. It's just quite extraordinary what they've put together. What this graph is showing you is the trend in homicide rates. I'll focus on homicide for now by age. So under 5 age, 5 to 14, 14 to 15 to 49, 50 to 69, 70 plus. And this covers the period between 1980 and 2021. This is the year when the Sustainable Development Goals start. Now, what I want you to be able to see here is that first, they all go down, right? They all tend to go down, starting around the mid-1990s. And they all go down along a broadly speaking linear path. And that's pretty much the evidence for most of the indicators that we are able to look at. Levels of interpersonal violence seem to be coming down slowly across the world. But we can't see clear and simple treatment effects. Here come the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is starting to accelerate. That's the other message I think that's important here. I will skip this scale and go straight to other data that come from UNODC, which are about differences, about projections. So what you can see here is now since 2000, the homicide rates here for women, the blue one for males, and that's the average. Across the world, most victims of homicide are male. About 75% or 78% of victims of homicide are male. And in societies with high levels of homicide, a larger proportion is male. The proportion, that doesn't mean that females are less exposed in absolute terms to violence, but it means that when you have high levels of violence, much violence is between gangs, much violence is organized, and you have a higher proportion of men ending up being involved in the violence and ending up being dead. So this is the trend which you already saw in the previous graph. It's now just plotted by gender until 2015. And so if you think about reducing violence by 50%, this is not eliminating it entirely, but just a reduction by 50%, this is where we would have to get to until 2030. So what I show you now is what actually happened empirically until 2021. And you can see that on each single indicator, we are missing the trend line already quite substantially. And if you extrapolate this trend line further, that we're currently on, this is just a linear trend, you will see that for whether it's for males, females, or both together, we will be far away from the actual goal. That doesn't mean that we will not have any reduction. I would expect that by 2030, we will be seeing some further reduction in the global levels of homicide, but they will be far away from what the Sustainable Development Goals are making us hope. So this leads me to the last part, if I may. Let me just check again, if I can. Yep. How do societies become less violent? So this is now the historian and sociologist in me talking. I'm going to change occupational identity a little bit. this is where this is coming from, this problem. Much of the evidence that is taken seriously in this global discourse around violence reduction comes from randomized controlled trials or similar evaluation studies of programs that are being disseminated somewhere. And the question is this the right approach? Well, if I asked it this way, it's probably not a good way of asking it, because I do think it's an important approach. What I want to ask is it the only approach, or do we need something else as well? And this has been called the gold standard. Here I want to show you a brief history of the gold standard. 1982, the gold standard was first introduced as in medical research as a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial. In 2015, Dan Nagin and Rob Sampson wrote a paper where they introduced the real gold standard, which is arguing against a randomized controlled trial. And they say valid inference is the criterion, and it's not about methodology. But, and I'm coming back to one of the most famous speakers in this series, John Maynard Keynes actually announced the end of the gold standard a long, long time ago already. So talking about gold standard seems to be wrong. Of course, he had something else in mind. He actually had the pound gold standard in mind. But what is the problem with the gold standard? In the paper, Dan Nagin and Rob Sampson say, well, the problem is with these randomized controlled trials that one needs to distinguish the question of whether there are treatment effects in a trial and whether there are treatment effects when you disseminate a policy at the population level. That's two different questions. And they don't necessarily lead to the same answer. And therefore, the extent to which results from trials can inform us about what we need to do at scale is somewhat limited. It's not an either or, but that's the argument that they make. And so this leads to this idea of a knowledge gap. We have increasing number of RCTs. We're beginning to learn how to scale them up. But we have, what we want is population level sustainable declines in violence. And it's unclear whether RCT-based programs are the best strategy. And so I want to broaden the horizon a little bit and look at examples of successful violence reductions at population level. And there are many such examples, and they have not been used, I think, systematically enough to understand what is going on. And what I want to do is to just show you one example of a comparison which I think is quite interesting. So I'll start here. It's become a habit of mine to just line up murder rates. We can talk about Oxford, which is somewhere far up there. So this is kind of like a map that shows it uses a logarithmic scale, and so you have quite a lot of variation here. And I'm just lining up countries on this vertical line. So this is just all the countries in the world by their homicide rate. Okay? So you're following me. So each of these dots is a country, and this is the lowest one, and this is the highest one. And it shows you the distribution of countries. Now, there are two countries that are the polar ends. Singapore is the lowest, with a homicide rate of about 0.1 per 100,000. And Jamaica is the highest, with a homicide rate of 52.1 per 100,000. Just so that you can imagine how big this difference is, in Jamaica, I think if I remember right, I would have to look this up again, but broadly speaking, about 10% of all men die from homicide. And in Singapore, it's about 0.01%, something along these lines. So it's a huge difference. If you think about it, this is a 1 to 500 difference. So being a historian, I've been looking at the history of homicide rates. How did they get there? And so in both countries there are colonial statistics for the pre-colonial. And so the interesting thing is the two countries until 1960s were actually undistinguishable. And there is no reason to assume that these two countries had, I'm sure there were biases in the statistics that were produced, but there's no reason to believe that these biases would have been massively skewed in either one of these countries. They had similar colonial bureaucratic structures that were producing these statistics. So if you think about this, Jamaica experiences an increase by about 650%. And what did I say, Singapore? No, it's Jamaica, of course. And Singapore experiences a decline by 96%. If you want to learn about something about population level decline, reduction in homicide, in violence, Singapore is actually an interesting case to learn about. And that doesn't mean that you need to necessarily like Singapore or think about Singapore as a model state. I'm just saying, empirically speaking, that's pretty close to something that one would like to understand what has been going on there. So one of the questions we can ask is, beyond just being similar in homicide rates, what else were they similar on? And in terms of counterfactual, so if you think about counterfactual thinking, they were astonishingly similar. They are similar in the GDP per capita, similar in years of education, literacy rate, life expectancy, birth rate. You go down this list, they were really quite interesting twins until in the years around 1960, around the year of independence. And I'm not going to go into these details. Also in terms of organized violence, for instance, different structures, different patterns of what was associated with violence, but in both societies there was quite a lot of organized violence. There were some differences. Of course, the length of colonial rule was different, and economic drivers were different, and Jamaica had a much long tradition of slavery, while Singapore, the Strait settlements, never had slavery. How different are the societies now? They're massively different. They're different in terms of GDP per capita. They're different in terms of life expectancy. They're different in scientific publications. And they're different on, for instance, levels of corruption and so on. I just wanted to flag up here the number of police killings. And this is, I'm not approving of the death penalty in Singapore, but people often talk about the death penalty in Singapore, and Jamaica does not have the death penalty, and it has many more police officers killing people during work, illegally sometimes, than Singapore has in terms of death penalty. This is a strange, so I just mean this as an illustration of not making simple moral judgments between these societies. The discrepancy in development was not just limited, by the way, to homicide. This is the discrepancy in the development of GDP per capita. Why did they develop so differently? Collier has developed this idea of critical junctures. So this idea that somewhere in the development of human societies, the people may be making critical decisions that then set off societies in distinct pathways that lead them to different types of problems. I don't know exactly what the answer is, why Singapore and Jamaica developed into such different developments. But there is a number of things that are actually interesting. Jamaica, and I think that is probably, in my view at least, is probably really the essential element here. Jamaica, already before independence, but then in the first year after independence, very quickly develops a political model that's based on clientelism. So the parties try to gain votes by co-opting people in the neighborhoods where they try to get votes, partly paying them, partly through corruption, while Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Jamaica, one of the things that is key to his ideas is the primacy of good impartial governance, rule of law, and the priority of fight against corruption. There is also an interesting difference in the education policy in that Jamaica puts a lot of effort into secondary education and higher education, while Singapore puts much more effort into primary education and professional training. So they have different trajectories of forming human capital, if you will. And there are differences in housing policy, which I find quite fascinating. Both societies were known for having slums before independence and of a similar size. What Singapore does is a housing policy that ends up actually having a compulsory mixing of neighborhoods policy, where you don't have segregation, while Jamaica goes down a route where you have increasing segregation between places. This is almost the final graph. Is criminal justice policy in play? What this graph shows you, and that's interesting for those if you want to have a conversation about deterrence and impunity. This is the number of people who end up being convicted for homicide among recorded homicide victims. And so in Jamaica, about 4%. The risk of being convicted is about 4% of those who commit a homicide, while in Singapore, it's basically 100%. It's 92% because some may have committed suicide or something else may have happened, but it's basically always 100%. So this leads me to my conclusions. I have 2 pages of conclusions. I think it's 9 conclusions. First of all, interpersonal violence is a really huge and really complex global challenge, and it overproportionally affects people in low and middle income countries. I want to summarize here again that 2 of the 3 violence-related targets define objectives that are based on normative human rights ideals rather than real-world feasibility. And I wanted to say I'm not entirely convinced that this is a wise strategy, because I'm not sure whether over time, I really do hope that in the next round, whatever the name will be, there will be another series of goals. And I really do hope that violence-related goals remain on the political agenda. And I'm reasonably confident that they will remain. But there is a risk if you aim for the absolute paradise that at some stage people become tired of being told that they're not achieving and not even moving towards achieving the goal that is formulated in these absolute ways. The violence-related SDGs have triggered substantial progress in a number of ways, and I'm not going to read this out again, but I think they have created a clear focus in global and national policy. There is an emergence of global knowledge and action framework. There is more consistent monitoring and benchmarking, especially in low and income contexts. And there is a development of evidence-based, freely available and culturally sensitive programs. It started with the pound training programs, but there are now, you can't do everything at the same time. It's also dependent on resources. I think there are now thoughts about moving into, for instance, social skills program in schools with the same idea, developing something that is really available, can be disseminated to scale in many different contexts. For homicides and other indicators, the evidence suggests a long-term declining trend globally since the mid-1990s. These trends are more likely triggered by general progress in affluence, education, technological control, and the rule of law than by specific programming. So one of the big drivers of levels of violence is just change in absolute levels of poverty. And as societies become wealthier, there is a number of reasons, and more kids are going to school, there is a large number of reasons why over time levels of interpersonal violence go down. It is highly unlikely, and I'm glad to see that we all agree on this, well, I'm not glad to see it, but I'm just stating here that it's highly unlikely that any of the 3 targets will be achieved. And I was trying to make the case that to achieve population-wide reductions in violence, we need to get a better understanding of the mechanisms that bring about population-wide reductions in violence. And that links to the topic of the socio-ecological model and saying, well, we really need to better understand, we can't be we can't be happy with just listing the risk factors in these different levels. We need to understand how policies actually translate into the daily lives. And we need to look at these macro level comparisons. That's point 8. And we need better research on what kinds of policy interventions have led to population level change in violence and integrate this into the programming. Thank you very much.